The Quiet Echoes, Chapter 1, The Porcelain Facade. The laughter in our Atlanta dining room was brittle, like thin ice. It echoed off the expensive china, bounced off the polished mahogany table, and grated on my nerves. Laura, my wife, was a whirlwind of practiced charm, her smile dazzling, her eyes sparkling with ambition. Tonight was crucial. Her boss, Mr. Thompson, and his wife were our guests. Laura had orchestrated every detail of this dinner party, from the artisanal cheese board to Sophie's perfectly coordinated dress. Sophie, my 6-year-old daughter, sat quietly beside me, her small hand fiddling with a pearl button on her dress. She was usually a vibrant, curious child, but around Laura's important guests, she became withdrawn, almost invisible, except for the occasional murmured word to her invisible friend, the quiet boy. Laura had forbidden any talk of him tonight. Absolutely no mention of your imaginary friend. Sophie, she'd hissed earlier, her voice tight with suppressed fury. Not one word, do you understand? You will be a perfect little lady. Sophie had nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but the connection to the quiet boy was a part of her, as natural as breathing. He was her confidant, her silent companion in a world that often felt too loud and too demanding. Lately, his whispers had grown more specific, more unsettling. He'd told her about a sad boat, about cold water, about a lost shell. As the evening wore on, the tension in the room thickened. Laura was pitching a new marketing strategy to Mr. Thompson, her voice smooth and confident. Sophie, however, seemed to absorb the undercurrents of stress, the unspoken anxieties in the room. Her small face scrunched up. She fidgeted, her brow furrowed. Suddenly, she pulled at my sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The quiet boy says the lady in the blue dress is very, very sad. Her little girl is sick. And the man in the red tie? He is angry. He wants to hurt someone." My blood ran cold. The lady in the blue dress was Mrs. Thompson. The man in the red tie was Laura's boss. Sophie, usually so soft-spoken, was picking up on something profoundly uncomfortable. Laura, mid-sentence about projected quarterly gains, faltered. She had heard. Everyone had. The room went silent. All eyes turned to Sophie. Sophie, Laura's voice, initially a strained whisper, quickly escalated into a furious shriek. "What did I tell you? There is no quiet boy. And you do not make up such ridiculous stories, especially not in front of our guests. You are embarrassing us. You are ruining everything." Mrs. Thompson looked uncomfortable, her eyes darting away. Mr. Thompson's face, usually jovial, hardened. "You are ruining our perfect family, Sophie." Laura screamed, her meticulously constructed facade crumbling. Her hands trembled, knocking over a crystal wine glass. Red wine blossomed across the white tablecloth, a stark symbol of the unraveling. "This is exactly what I meant. You are a spectacle, a bizarre, unacceptable spectacle. You are a stain on everything I've worked for." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. She recoiled, burying her face against my side. I wrapped my arm around her, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Laura, stop it," I shouted, my voice hoarse. "You're terrifying her." "Oh, I'm terrifying her?" Laura retorted, her voice dripping with venom. She stalked around the table, her eyes wild. "She's terrifying me. She's ruining our reputation, our future. I can't live like this, David, not with a child who threatens everything I've built." She marched to her study, returning moments later with a folder. She slammed it onto the table, the papers scattering. "Sign these, David. Divorce papers, custody agreement. You can have her. I can't do this anymore. I want a life where I'm not constantly embarrassed. And Sophie needs to go to a specialized boarding school. Now. My mind reeled. Divorce, boarding school. For Sophie, my daughter. My quiet, sensitive, extraordinary daughter. I won't sign them, Laura, I said, my voice low, trembling with a fury I rarely allowed myself to feel. Not now, not ever. Laura stared at me, her eyes narrowed. Then get out, David. Take her and get out. I don't want to see either of you in my house ever again. My house? My home. It suddenly felt like a prison of porcelain and pretense. I stood, pulling Sophie close. Her small body shook with silent sobs. I walked to the front door. The hushed whispers of our guests following us. The cool night air hit us as we stepped outside, a blessed relief from the suffocating atmosphere within. As I started the car, I glanced back at the house, a grand, imposing structure that now felt utterly hollow. The perfect facade had shattered, and in its place, a desolate void. Chapter 2: The Compass of Echoes. We drove for hours, Sophie asleep in the back seat, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the passing streetlights. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. Laura's words echoed in my head, a cruel refrain, ruining our perfect family. The bitter irony. Our family had never been perfect. It was a carefully constructed illusion, maintained by Laura's relentless pursuit of social validation. I drove to my old college friend Mark's house in Birmingham, Alabama. He was a gruff but kind-hearted soul, a single dad himself who understood the complexities of raising a child. He welcomed us without question, offering a spare room and a silent, comforting presence. The next morning, Sophie was quieter than usual, her gaze distant, almost as if she were seeing something beyond the visible. The quiet boy was with her. The quiet boy says the little boat is waiting, she murmured, tracing patterns on a steamy window pane. And the water is very, very cold, and there's a sad light. Far away. My heart ached for her. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a phase. This was something deeper. The divorce papers arrived at Mark's house a few days later. Laura was relentless. Her lawyer called, aggressive and demanding. I refused to engage, focusing solely on Sophie. I decided to seek professional help. Mark suggested Dr. Evelyn Reed, a renowned child psychologist known for her work with highly sensitive and empathic children. Her office was in a quiet part of Birmingham, filled with soft colors and comforting textures. Dr. Reed was a woman of gentle wisdom, her eyes kind and perceptive. I explained Sophie's situation, the invisible friend, the uncanny observations, Laura's reaction. I tried to sound rational, but I could hear the desperation in my own voice. Dr. Reed listened patiently, her gaze unwavering. "David," she began, her voice soft but firm, "what you're describing sounds like high sensitivity, perhaps even an advanced form of empathy. Some children are incredibly attuned to the emotions and energies around them. They absorb them. The quiet boy, he could be a manifestation of this, a way for Sophie to process overwhelming sensory input, or perhaps even a symbolic representation of a deep-seated emotion or memory that she's picking up on." "But he tells her things," I insisted, frustrated. "Things she couldn't possibly know, like the sad boat, the cold water, the specific emotions of strangers." Dr. Reed nodded. Indeed, this is where it gets interesting. Some individuals, often labeled as highly intuitive or psychic, have the ability to perceive information beyond the ordinary five senses. They might pick up on energetic imprints left in a place, or on the emotional residue of an event. It's not madness, David. It's a different way of perceiving reality, and it can be incredibly isolating in a world that doesn't understand it. Her words resonated with me. Laura's fear of what was not normal, my own fear buried deep of not understanding my daughter. The sad light, the cold water, the lost shell. Dr. Reed mused, her brow furrowed in thought. These sound like recurring motifs, almost like a story that needs to be told, or a memory trying to surface. Perhaps Sophie is sensing a past event, a tragedy, tied to a specific location. Where? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. How do I find it? Dr. Reed smiled gently. Sophie is your compass, David. Her perceptions, her whispers, are the clues. You need to follow them and trust them. The idea felt utterly insane, yet profoundly right. My rational mind screamed against it, but my father's heart, desperate for answers, yearned for understanding. I had to follow the whispers. I had to understand my daughter. Chapter 3, The Ocean's Lament. Sophie's whispers from the quiet boy grew more insistent, more visual. He showed her a big, tall house near the ocean, a very old light, and lots of sand. He spoke of fish that swim close to the surface, and a boy who loved the sea. I spread a map of the southeast U.S. on Mark's kitchen table. Where, Sophie? I asked, my finger tracing the coastline. Where is this place? Sophie's small finger drifted across the map, pausing over the coast of South Carolina. Here, she said, her eyes distant, her face soft. The quiet boy says here, near the little towns, and a very old light. A quick search on my phone revealed a scattering of small, historic lighthouses along the South Carolina coast. One in particular caught my eye. The old Cypress Point Lighthouse, long decommissioned, located on a small, relatively isolated island, accessible by a causeway. It was known for its mournful foghorn and its history of shipwrecks. This one? I asked, pointing to a photograph of the lighthouse. Sophie's eyes widened. Yes, that one. The quiet boy says that's the sad light. My decision was made. We packed a small bag. Mark, though skeptical, offered his unwavering support. Find your answers, David, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. And whatever you find, remember Sophie is your daughter. That's all that matters. The drive to the South Carolina coast was long, the landscape slowly transforming from rolling hills to flat, marshy terrain. The air grew humid, salty, carrying the scent of the ocean. Sophie, nestled in the back, seemed calmer, almost anticipatory. As we crossed the long, narrow causeway onto the island, the Cypress Point Lighthouse loomed in the distance, a stark, sentinel-like structure against the vast expanse of the Atlantic. It was exactly as the quiet boy had described to Sophie. "It's here, Daddy," Sophie exclaimed, pointing excitedly. "The sad light and the cold water." We parked the car and walked along the deserted beach. The sand was cool beneath our feet, the waves crashing rhythmically against the shore. A powerful, endless lament. Sophie suddenly pulled at my hand, leading me towards a cluster of wind-swept dunes. "Here," she whispered, kneeling down, her small hands digging in the sand. "The quiet boy says it's here, his boat. My heart pounded. I watched as her fingers brushed against something hard. She pulled it out, a small wooden toy boat, intricately carved, smoothed by years of tumbling in the ocean's embrace. It was old, weathered, but clearly a child's toy. The quiet boy loved his boat, Sophie said softly, clutching it to her chest. He loved the sea. A profound sense of awe washed over me. This wasn't just imagination. This was something real, something deeply resonant. We walked towards the lighthouse, a structure that felt imbued with a palpable sense of history. As we approached, the door creaked open and a woman emerged. She was elderly, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes a startling shade of sea green, full of a quiet wisdom. She wore a thick, hand-knitted shawl, despite the mild weather. She was the lighthouse keeper, or perhaps its guardian. Her gaze fell on Sophie, then on the wooden boat in Sophie's hands. A gasp escaped her lips. "Hello," I said, my voice feeling strangely inadequate. "My name is David." "This is my daughter, Sophie. She was drawn here." The woman's eyes, fixed on Sophie, welled with tears. "I know," she whispered, her voice husky with emotion. "I've been waiting for a very long time." Chapter 4: The Sentinel's Sorrow. The lighthouse keeper, whose name was Margaret, led us inside. The interior was cool and quiet, smelling of salt and old wood. Spiral stairs wound upwards, leading to the lamp room. Margaret moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her eyes never leaving Sophie. "That boat," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "It belonged to my son, Thomas. He made it himself. He loved the sea more than anything." My heart constricted. Her son, lost at sea. This was it, the core of the sadness Sophie had been feeling. "Thomas, he disappeared 60 years ago," Margaret continued, her voice filled with an ancient sorrow. "Just a boy, barely 8 years old. He went out in his little boat, just off this shore. A squall blew in suddenly. The Coast Guard searched for weeks. They never found him. Not a trace. Not a single trace." She looked at Sophie, her gaze intense. "But I always felt him, always. A quiet presence, a whisper on the wind. I kept the light burning, even after they decommissioned the lighthouse. For him, for his memory, for the hope that one day he would find his way home." "The quiet boy is Thomas," Sophie said, her voice soft, as if stating the most obvious truth in the world. "He loves the sea, and he was sad because he couldn't come home." Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face, but her eyes held a profound light, not of sorrow, but of recognition. "Yes," she choked out. "Yes, he is, my Thomas, my beautiful boy." She turned to me. "My family," Margaret explained, her voice gaining strength. "The women in my family, we have a gift, a sensitivity. We can feel things, see things, hear things that others cannot. My mother, my grandmother, they all had it, but it was suppressed, hidden, called nerves or imagination. They feared it, feared what others would say, feared being labeled as strange. My mother warned me not to speak of it, but I couldn't deny it when he was here, when he came back as a whisper." She looked at Sophie with reverence. "Your daughter, David, she has it, stronger than any of us. She hears him, she sees him. She has brought my Thomas home." Sophie walked to Margaret, holding out the little wooden boat. Margaret took it, clutching it to her chest, tears flowing freely. It was a reunion across decades, across realms. "He wants you to know," Sophie said, her eyes distant, her voice a calm echo. He was looking at the clouds. He was thinking of your cookies. He tried to swim back, but the water was too strong, and he lost his shell, his pretty blue shell, near the big rock with the seaweed. Margaret sobbed, a deep, cleansing sound. My sweet boy, my little sailor. He always loved to collect shells, and I always made him cookies before he went to the beach. She looked at me, a profound gratitude in her gaze. This is a gift, David, not a burden, a gift. Suddenly, the lighthouse door creaked open again. A man stood there, older, with kind, tired eyes. He wore a faded, well-worn Coast Guard cap. "Lieutenant Cullen?" Margaret asked, surprised. "What are you doing here?" The man's eyes widened as he saw the wooden boat in Margaret's hands. I heard the lighthouse lamp was on," he stammered, his voice hoarse. "I come by sometimes, just to check, for old time's sake." "Lieutenant Cullen," Margaret said, her voice trembling with a new emotion. "This is David, and this is Sophie. She has something to tell you about Thomas." Lieutenant Cullen, now retired, had been one of the young officers who had searched for Thomas decades ago. He had carried the weight of the unsolved disappearance, the grief of the family, for a lifetime. Sophie, prompted by a whisper from the quiet boy, looked at Lieutenant Cullen. "The quiet boy says he was scared, but he wasn't alone. He saw a big white bird, and he wanted to tell you he was sorry. He was trying to get home. He lost his medal, the one with the anchors near the overturned rowboat." Lieutenant Cullen's face paled. He had been on the search team that found an overturned rowboat, but no medal. He had always carried the guilt of not finding Thomas. The details Sophie provided, things only the search team would have known, things that were never publicly released, were impossibly accurate. His eyes filled with tears, a lifetime of suppressed grief finally overflowing. He's telling me," Lieutenant Cullen whispered, his voice broken. "He's telling me his last moments. He's telling me he made it to that rowboat, and that he saw the albatross. I never knew. I always blamed myself." A profound sense of peace settled over the room. Thomas, through Sophie, had finally found his way home, not as a living boy, but as an echo, a memory-given voice, bringing solace to those he had left behind. The quiet boy was not an imaginary friend. He was a messenger, a conduit for healing. Chapter 5: The Tides of Acceptance. The days that followed were a blur of shared stories, emotional releases, and a profound sense of revelation. Margaret, her eyes shining with renewed life, became a fount of family history. She spoke of the hidden lineage of sensitive women in their family, of the gifts that were suppressed, the fears that overshadowed true understanding. She began to teach Sophie, gently, how to interpret the echoes, how to discern between her own emotions and the energies of others. Lieutenant Cullen, relieved of a lifelong burden, found a new peace. He returned to the island regularly, sometimes just sitting with Margaret, sharing quiet moments, sometimes watching Sophie play on the beach, a silent guardian. I called Laura. The conversation was calm, devoid of the previous venom. I explained as best I could the revelations about Thomas, Evelyn, and Sophie's gift. I spoke of the family history, the suppressed sensitivities. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Laura's voice, cold and distant, filtered through. "I don't understand any of this, David. It sounds delusional. I cannot accept it. This isn't the life I signed up for, and I certainly won't have my daughter involved in such things." "I know, Laura," I said, my voice steady, "and that's okay. But Sophie needs a home where she is loved and accepted for exactly who she is, and that's what I'm going to give her." The divorce was finalized quickly. There was no more fight, just a mutual recognition of irreconcilable differences. Laura wanted a life of manufactured perfection. I wanted a life of authentic truth, no matter how extraordinary. I made the decision to move to the island. I sold my house in Atlanta, shedding the last vestiges of the life Laura and I had built on a foundation of pretense. I bought a small, charming cottage near the lighthouse, a place where Sophie could grow up surrounded by nature, by the ocean, by the whispers she could now understand and channel. Dr. Reed continued to work with Sophie remotely, guiding her, helping her to understand and develop her unique abilities. She emphasized grounding techniques, emotional regulation, and the importance of discerning which echoes to engage with and which to simply observe. Sophie blossomed, her quietness transformed into a serene confidence. She spent hours on the beach, communicating with the sea, with the ancient energies of the island. She would sometimes close her eyes, a soft smile on her face, listening to the murmurs of the unseen world. The quiet boy, Thomas, would appear less and less, his mission complete. He had found his peace, his story told, his family connected. He left Sophie with a deep understanding, a heightened sensitivity, and a clear path forward. My relationship with my parents was still fractured, but I began to send them letters, slowly, carefully, explaining the truths I had uncovered. I didn't expect immediate acceptance, but I hoped that over time they might come to understand. Life on the island was simple, profound, and deeply fulfilling. I found a new purpose in protecting Sophie, in nurturing her extraordinary gift. We spent our days exploring the tide pools, listening to the crashing waves, and sometimes sitting in the old lighthouse, listening to Margaret's stories, to the echoes of the past, and to the quiet whispers of the future. My daughter, Sophie, was not ruining our family. She was redefining it. She was leading me to a deeper understanding of love, acceptance, and the vast, mysterious connections that bind us all. The perfect facade had shattered, but in its place, a true, resilient family had emerged, built on the foundations of empathy, honesty, and the quiet echoes of a soul finally at peace. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, unequivocally home.